Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And today, talking about a subject that, well, I was going to say it's not controversial, but it probably is controversial in the context of gaming to a certain extent, but it's just not, political or anything like that. I've been gone here for a little while, took a week off, and then inappropriate characters on Sunday, and here's my video. I'm going to be talking today about social mechanics in RPGs, which I think is one of the really big differences between what you can call new school gaming and old school gaming. And here's one of those things, like I've termed in my video series, DnD stuff they taught you wrong on purpose, because in newer editions of the game and in other new school RPGs, what you have to resolve social interactions are a whole series of social skills, right? So you might have, detect lies and, no, that's sense motive. That's what they call the skill, right? Sense motive and diplomacy and deception and stuff along those lines that are skills treated in the same way that you would treat something like, wilderness lore or how to pick a pocket. Physical activities, basically, or intellectual ones. But to me, this is something that really takes away from the role-playing experience. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have any kind of social skills, but the way that social interaction is handled in old school, to me, seems infinitely better. And one of the big lies that people have been taught is that this idea that in old school D&D, you just didn't have role-playing, right? That there just wasn't, since there were no social mechanics, obviously there was no social RP going on, and that's absolute nonsense. Old school games are full of social RP, and the difference is that people do it through, guess what? Role-playing. You play your character, and the DM plays the NPC, and you have to play it by ear, interacting in a way, and that requires certain skills that, because of social skills, those skills are either atrophied or not developed in new school players. And that's a real shame, because this is a big part of the role-playing experience. It reminds me of, I think it was supposed to be Laurence Olivier, that he was doing a production, a movie or something with some other, I don't know if it was Dustin Hoffman or who, some newer school actor who had this whole method and stuff, and he was trying to work out this whole system by which he would interpret his character in this play. And at one point, Olivier looks at him and says, "Well, man, why don't you just act it?" And this is kind of, it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of the gist of what marks the difference between old school and new school play. So in old school games like Lion and Dragon, for instance, or the original editions of D&D, or almost any other OSR type game, from the old school Renaissance, you don't have those skills that a character will have that they will check for social situations. And this is good for a couple of reasons. It's good mechanically because it avoids certain abuses. The big abuse I've seen is that you inevitably get some player that min-maxes on social skills and then feels that those social skills should act as a superpower, right? They should work the way that Charm Person does. I recall one instance where I was running a superhero campaign, and this one character who had no power that could affect what he was facing was confronted with like a godlike being, and he decided to use intimidation on him, and he had a really high intimidation skill, and so he just insisted that because he rolled it and he got like a 30, that means that he should be able to scare this deity that he couldn't possibly hurt, right? That he couldn't do anything, and to scare him, even the way, even in new school games, I insist that players explain and play out what they're saying or doing in the context of those social skills, which some DMs don't even do that, right? But in this context, he didn't even make an argument that would have swayed or intimidated this NPC. But because he got the role, he wanted to demand that it work for him, and in a sense he had an argument there, because of course he'd put a ton of points into that, points that could have gone to other skills, and so what's a DM to do in that system? And this is why the system itself, systems that have heavy social skills, are flawed, because if you have heavy social skills and a player invests heavily on social skills, then why would those social skills be treated differently than, say, a character that invests heavy amounts of points in driving, right? If you put 20 points into your driving skill and your character gets like a 30 in driving, and yet he doesn't manage to drive, then the player has a right to feel ripped off. And in that same context, if he put 20 points into diplomacy and he fails to be diplomatic, then he would have a right to feel pissed off. So what it means is that ultimately the role-playing part of it has to be subsumed to the mechanical part. And then you end up in a situation where a player doesn't really have to say anything. They just have to roll high. That's the only thing that they should be, under that context, required to do. And of course, some DMs try to fudge this by making kind of like a hybrid demand, right? Like what I was trying to do in that campaign, where you say, well, yeah, but you have to play it out a bit, right? But, you don't tell them that they have to play out driving. So fundamentally, the way that old school games do it is, I think, a lot better, because they don't have a player-centric social mechanic that the player can then insist should make the role more important than the role playing, right? And again, if you have a system that has that, then the role should probably be more important than the role play if the player had any say at all in where he invested his points, because otherwise you're doing an injustice to the player in that sense. In old school games, here's what happens, right? You have abilities that are related to things like combat, to, horse riding, to thief skills and things like that. But what you don't have are social skills that are related to how good you are at lying or manipulating people or demanding things or intimidating people or judging the motivations of people. You have to play that out. And so that will oblige a player to develop their character, to think through the lens of their character, and to try to act out an appropriate element of how and what and in what way are they going to try to socially interact with the NPCs or what have you, and also with other players. Because, of course, that's another question in new school games. If a guy has like 20 points in Intimidate, shouldn't he be able to intimidate the other players? Why are the other players miraculously immune to that, right? Why can he intimidate like some real badass NPC, but the nebbish player next to him has no effect at all, right? I mean, because if the player next to him said, well, PvP, I'm going to hit you, and he has a plus 20 to hit, he's probably going to hit the player with the high social skills. So why can't the player with the high social skills just use his social skill to manipulate and dominate the entire party without doing a lick of roleplay? In old school, you don't have this problem, because there, the players have to actually roleplay how they interact with each other, and they have to roleplay how they interact with the NPCs in exactly the same way. Now, this also requires certain skills from the DM, and I think this is where new school games started to rely more on social skills, because it's kind of a shortcut for bad DMing. If you're doing things the old school way and you don't have the social skills, then a DM will be obliged to have to think very carefully about what will or will not work in the context of each interaction at its moment. So that means the DM has to have thought through the NPC that the player character is interacting with, and thought through very carefully what will or will not motivate that NPC. So that if a player makes an argument, or intimidates in a way, or whatever, lies in an effective way that will manipulate the NPC, the DM has to know that and let that work. And if not, then it doesn't matter how elaborate or fluid or florid the player's words are. it's not going to convince him. A DM also has to have a certain element of patience with PCs, with players rather, not the player characters, but the players themselves, in that obviously players are going to have different levels of eloquence and social ability. Now, some of this might be a little bit unfair, right? Like, obviously a player who's really good at speaking in an old school game will have an advantage in interactions with NPCs than a player who is, shy or stammering or just not good with words. But the DM should try to balance that a bit, especially based on what the player's character is like. And there is something to do that with in old school gaming that I'm going to touch on in a second. But what it means also is that the DM needs to consider what the player character is versus the player. All of these are things that you can learn. They're trainable with practice, basically. And a good DM will be able to do that. But they won't if all they're ever doing is needing to rely on social mechanics that abstract the whole process and take away from role-playing. Like the argument that old school games are worse at role-playing than new school games, because new school games artificially simulate social interaction instead of just role-playing it, is completely ridiculous, right? It's exactly the reverse. If you have social mechanics, you're not role-playing it. If you're role-playing it, then you're obviously doing more role-play than if you're just rolling a die to do diplomacy check, right? So what can you use within the old school game? Well, the first thing, obviously, in a D&D style game, an OSR style game, so in something like Lion and Dragon, you have the charisma stat, because that's something from old school. And the charisma stat gives you an impression as a DM, first of all, of how charismatic the player character as opposed to the player will be. So even if you have a player who isn't, who's a bit shy or soft-spoken or isn't very good at putting convincing words together, if the character that he's playing has a very high charisma, that should affect things. If the character that is being played by someone who has a player that has a lot of social skills, has a low charisma, then the DM should consider that too. And there's obviously lots of people who are very eloquent with words, but for whatever reason have some unlikability that can work against them, right? So you might have a player who has, a 6 charisma, a very low charisma, but they're really, really good with words, they're really convincing. Okay, well then, what you have to consider is, first of all, what they're saying. Because even a character with low charisma, if they say the right things, if they bribe the official in just the right way, rather than in a terribly wrong way that's going to insult him or outrage him or something like that, or if they lie to a person about just the right thing and not any number of other things that aren't good at, to something that the person would believe, then that should work regardless of a person's charisma level. But if a person's trying to, be convincing, but they have a very low charisma, then at times, what that could mean is that the person could say the right sort of words, but might end up seeming in some way false or arrogant or, presumptuous and still not really get it through. So how do you judge those things? Well, in old school gaming, there's a very, very simple mechanic. There's something called the reaction roll. The reaction roll is a 2d6 roll. There are other versions. There are some versions where you do 2d10 or other things too. But the classic version of the reaction roll is on a scale of 2 to 12, where you roll 2d6 and you modify that number by the charisma modifier of a player character. So if they have a high charisma, it'll be higher. If they have a low charisma, it'll be lower. And the lower you get in the result, the less favorable, the less friendly that the person you're interacting will be likely to take something. Now, this is very clever in a number of ways because it's not centered on the player. The player doesn't do the reaction roll. The DM does. So the player has to role play. The DM, if they're not sure how that interaction should work out in actual play, can do a reaction check. And there they can decide, well, it's okay, so if the roll is very poor, then he took it the wrong way. If the roll is very high, then he totally fell for it. And if it's somewhere in the middle, then it should probably go in favor of the player if the player said everything right or said all the right things, right? And this is very, very different because now you're having a reactive response rather than the player having something that they have points in, that they're invested in, that they should be able to weaponize like they do in social mechanics and new school gaming. So this is an essential element of old school play. Now, what is this video leading to? Well, if you're an old school gamer, you probably know all this already, but I think it's a very good idea that we should try to crusade in favor of this. It was one of the things that when I was helping on the D&D 5th edition, I really tried to impress on Mike Bros. I knew it wasn't going to happen right from the beginning, because I knew it was a bridge too far for the new school crowd to ever accept. But I tried anyways. I really pushed to try to convince Mike Merles that D&D 5th edition should have no social skills at all, and it should rely on reaction rolls and charisma and role-playing. But I knew that wasn't really going to work out. But I still think it's a very noble thing to do. So how can we help bring that about and help create a game that ends up liberating the role-playing part of the role-playing game in the old school way? Well, obviously one thing you can do is you can share this video and pass it around everywhere that you think people might be receptive to it. So, and that helps me out too. So obviously I've got a vested interest in that, but I'd be really appreciative if you were to help by sharing this video. But besides that, you can also, try to comment about it with new school players. And if you're running a new school game or you're playing in one, then why not try to suggest, like if you're playing 5th edition D&D, one of the things that I did really succeed in impressing in when I was consulting on 5th edition is the importance of modularity. 5th edition can very easily be altered. So, and it's already not nearly as dependent on social mechanics as you see in like 3rd edition, which was completely socially mechanized. So why not suggest the altering, the tweaking of the rules in a campaign that you're going to play to, remove the social mechanic and replace it with reaction rules, and explain the virtues of that using the sort of thing I've talked about here. And if you're a new school player, then the same thing applies. Why not? I mean, on the one hand, I would certainly say check out old school games and try playing those, because they're awesome, right? They're a very different thing than the new school games, and you're probably going to like them a lot. If you like the sound of some of the things I've said, check out, I've got another video on this channel about how the OSR will change the way you think about RPGs. It's one of my earlier videos, so you might have to scroll down quite a bit. But basically, OSR games are totally radical alternative takes on the classic D&D system. So anybody who's played 5th edition will immediately recognize how to play the game, but it'll change the way you play the game, and it'll take it in new and interesting directions. Like, for example, Lion and Dragon is a medieval authentic version of the old school rules that emphasizes things like the medieval culture and elements that appeared in the medieval paradigm. The magic system's totally different based on medieval magical grimoires and things like that. It's the combat has been made in some ways more brutal to reflect the sort of Middle Ages style combat you see in shows like Game of Thrones and things like that. Even things like the price lists, the customs and rules, the church, all of that stuff is medieval, and it's to run a medieval campaign. But there's lots of other OSR games if that doesn't appeal to you. But you should definitely check out the OSR. But if you're not going to yet, I hope someday you will, but if you're not going to yet, then why not try for yourself this notion of taking the plunge of removing the social mechanics from the RPG you're playing. And if it's a game like 5th edition, that's easy to do. In some other games, it might require more tweaking, especially if you've got like these complicated point-buy games where it's expected that players are going to be spending points on social skills. If you have characters that have a lot of social skill elements that aren't meant to be magical, then you might have to do some adapting there too. But it's worth the effort, because usually it doesn't take that much to change it. And if you do change it, what you're going to find is that players are going to get into a whole different level of how they interact with their player characters and how those player characters interact with the world. And you, and how you run your NPCs, are going to have to get into a whole different level of how you immerse into those NPCs and make them three-dimensional living people that you have to understand, what they're about in a deeper way to be able to successfully interact with the player characters. That's everything for today. Please subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell, because if not, you might not find out what else is going on. And I have a Patreon and I have a PayPal page, but I think one of the best ways, if you want to help support me and help get me to start making more videos more often, I'm going to start up making some more videos now again, and some live streams probably too. If you want to get me to do more of those, then help out by supporting my RPG work. And you can do that by purchasing my products, like Lion and Dragon and Dark Albion. And I've just released the RPG Pundit's Old School Companion, the Medieval Authentic Companion, which is a 266-page book full of stuff, material that if you have Lion and Dragon, you can use it, you can just plug it right into Lion and Dragon. But everything there, almost everything there, is also stuff that you could bring directly into any OSR game or any edition of D&D that you can use to add as much or little as much medieval authentic stuff into your game as you like, including a huge section on really different magic than the classic D&D magic that you can use to replace your magic system or to add to it, to have other stuff, because a lot of it is based off of like things like grimoires and things that player characters could find or learn. And then there's a whole bunch of other material, lots and lots of stuff. Once I get my author's copy, I'll do a review video of it here, but it hasn't arrived yet because damned postal service down here. But yeah, check that out, because that's a totally great thing. And besides that, check out the RPG Pundit Presents series. If you only got a few bucks, but you still want to support me and you want to get something out of it, the RPG Pundit Presents PDF series, which the link will be in the description below. The link to all this will be in that description. Has now we're at, I think, issue 98. Every issue is somewhere between 99 cents to $5. And it has a supplemental material that is everything from like weird gonzo fantasy to medieval authentic stuff to adventures to monster guides to all sorts of things that you'll be, sending me a tip, but you will also be getting something that I'm sure you're going to find in those 98 issues, something that'll interest you that you can use for your games, to add to your world or to your mechanics that you like. So check all that out. And most of all, and once again, share this video so that everybody gets a chance to consider the argument of liberating yourself from the shackles of social mechanics. Currently smoking Dunhill Amber Root Bulldog, plus Cornell and Deal's Crowley's Best.